He wasn't an angel. That sentence alone feels like sacrilege when spoken about George Harrison. For decades, the world believed he was the quiet one, the spiritual beetle, the man who escaped ego and fame in search of something higher. But at 80 years old, Eric Clapton finally broke the silence that had weighed on him for half a century, and what he revealed shattered the image people had worshipped. "I used to think I was the sinner," Clapton said softly. "Then I realized George wasn't pure either." For 50 years, Clapton carried a truth that never healed. Not because he hated George Harrison, but because he loved him enough to protect the myth, until age, regret, and memory stripped away the need to pretend. And when George passed away, he left behind a question that never found peace. Who was George Harrison when the lights went out and the incense burned low? Who was he when no one was watching? To answer that, Clapton didn't speak as a critic. He spoke as a friend who had seen both the light and the shadow, and knew they lived in the same man. When the Beatles reached their creative peak in the late 1960s, the world watched George Harrison transform. He embraced Indian philosophy, meditation, and Eastern spirituality. The sitar became his voice. The press hailed him as enlightened, detached, evolved. But behind the calm exterior, Clapton saw something different. People saw peace in George. He said, "I saw a storm." According to Clapton, George was the first to bring LSD into Abbey Road. He was also the last to leave when the night spiraled out of control. By day, he spoke of karma and liberation. By night, he slipped away from his estate and vanished into private clubs until dawn. He said he was searching for enlightenment, Clapton recalled, but every time he came back, his eyes looked emptier. That was the first crack in the image. The world adored a quiet saint. Clapton saw a man splitting himself in two, preaching detachment while chasing desire. The contradiction deepened in 1968. Clapton recorded a blues demo, rough and personal, meant only for himself. Weeks later, George arrived with a song that sounded almost identical. When Clapton confronted him, George smiled and said, "I didn't copy you. God inspired me." Clapton said nothing, but something inside him broke. That was the moment I realized he had lost the line between faith and deceit. As the Beatles began to fracture, George played the role of peacemaker. He appeared calm while John and Paul clashed. The public saw wisdom. Clapton saw ambition. One night at Frier Park, Clapton remembered, George laughed and said, "If John and Paul fight, at least I'll get more songs on the album." To Clapton, it wasn't humor. It was hunger disguised as serenity. Beneath the meditation beads lived a man desperate not to be forgotten. The fourth Beatle, forever in the shadow of Lennon and McCartney. And then there was Pattie Boyd. To the world, George and Pattie were the perfect couple. Photographs showed gardens, sitars, sunlight, devotion. They were hailed as the symbol of love fused with spirituality. But Clapton saw what the cameras missed. "I thought George was the most devoted husband I'd ever known," he said, "until I saw him look at another woman with the same eyes Pattie once dreamed of." During the recording sessions for All Things Must Pass, cracks began to form. Pattie waited for hours in the studio. Nights passed. George disappeared. And then Clapton saw him leave side by side with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife. "He smiled at me," Clapton said. "The kind of smile someone gives when they're doing wrong but pretending it's normal." When Ringo discovered the affair, he left home. George didn't apologize. Instead, he sank deeper into what he called universal love. Love isn't bound by earthly rules, George told him. Love is karma. To Clapton, it sounded like faith twisted into justification. George could chant for hours, then use those same words to excuse betrayal. He preached liberation, yet chained himself to desire. He spoke of compassion, yet shattered the people closest to him. When Pattie finally broke down, she went to Clapton's home. She cried and said, "I don't recognize the man I married anymore." That night, Clapton realized something terrifying. "I loved her," he said, "not out of impulse, out of pity." At first, he stayed silent. She was his friend's wife. But guilt has a way of growing louder than loyalty. In 1971, trapped between rage and heartbreak, Clapton wrote Layla. The world heard a love song. George heard a message. I didn't write it because I loved Pattie, Clapton admitted. I wrote it because I was angry. Every chord carried accusation. Every note whispered a truth the world refused to hear. When asked about the song later, George smiled and said, I know who it's for, but love doesn't belong to anyone. To Clapton, it was the coldest thing he'd ever heard. George and Pattie divorced in 1974. Pattie left Frier Park carrying the memory of a man she once thought was holy, only to discover he was deeply human and deeply broken. Clapton and Pattie eventually came together, but Clapton never called it victory. I didn't steal my friend's wife, he said. I took back what he had thrown away. But the story didn't end there. After the divorce, George didn't return to peace. He disappeared into faith. From the outside, Frier Park looked like heaven, gardens, lotus ponds, music drifting through the air. Inside, Clapton said, it felt like something else entirely. George wasn't meditating anymore, he said. He was performing rituals. Once a month, George held what he called nights of cleansing. Incense filled the hall. Candles burned low. Monks chanted for hours. If anyone stopped, Clapton recalled, George stared at them and said, your soul isn't awake yet. At midnight, drums thundered. George demanded they beat the evil out of their bodies. His eyes glowed. His voice didn't sound like the man Clapton once knew. Later, George told him John Lennon's spirit still visited him through the smoke. He said John talked to him. Clapton whispered. That's when I knew he wasn't finding God. He was running from guilt. Visitors were forced to chant before meals. Guitars were placed on altars. George demanded devotion, not friendship. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. He didn't need friends anymore, Clapton said. He needed followers. When Clapton tried to intervene, George smiled and said, you don't understand true spirituality. Maybe he was right, Clapton admitted. Maybe all I understood was loneliness. After John Lennon's death, George collapsed entirely. He burned incense all night and played Here Comes the Sun with trembling hands. He believed John was listening, Clapton said. I think by then, George didn't know who he was talking to anymore. Even after Clapton married Pattie, George remained present. Late-night calls, notes from Frier Park, strange statements. He once told me, Clapton said, if I die, I'll merge into you. That way I'll still have Pattie. George wasn't angry. That frightened Clapton more than rage ever could. He forgave me, Clapton said, but he never let go. By the 1990s, George feared something more than death. He feared being forgotten. Every time I visited, Clapton recalled, he asked, do they still remember me? He drank not for pleasure but memory. Some nights, he played the song he wrote for Pattie and cried alone. In 1998, George sent Clapton a handwritten note with a single line, I forgive, but I don't forget. Clapton understood immediately. George had forgiven everyone except himself. When cancer came, George wore a gentle smile. The world believed he was at peace. He wasn't, Clapton said. He was afraid of leaving with things unresolved. Before he died, George asked only one thing, keep our music alive. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away. Clapton sat in silence, unable to speak. I lost my friend, he said, and the rest of my youth. A year later, Clapton organized the concert for George. When he played, he wasn't honoring a saint. He was making amends. The applause wouldn't stop. Tears streamed down his face. George left in the light, he whispered. But that light was born from our darkness. At 80 years old, Clapton finally told the truth, not to destroy George Harrison's legacy, but to free it. He wasn't a saint, Clapton said. He was human, and I loved him for that. Because behind every legend is a man, and behind every man is a story only those closest dare to tell. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it.